Well, hi everyone. Thank you. My name is Wes, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about stem cell ethics. Before we begin, I would like to give a special thank you to my faculty, Dr. Garash, Professor Wilson, and Professor McAlpin. Okay. So to begin, I'd just also like to give you a little bit about information about myself. As you probably noticed, I am ambulatory challenged. I do use crutches. This is the result of having a spinal cord injury about 5 years ago. As a result, I've become very interested in different methods for treating spinal cord injury as well as potential cures in the future. This quote I have here is from a friend of mine that I did rehabilitation with who was quadriplegic actually, and it reads as follows. It's not about being able to walk again, it's about being able to throw a fastball, to go to the beach and feel sand beneath my toes, or between my toes, sorry. And I feel like this really captures the sentiment of a lot of people who have spinal cord injuries, such as myself, feel that something was lost. You know, part of your life was taken from you, and you just want that back. So I was very excited with the latest developments in stem cell research. That in January 2009, a company by the name of Geron got FDA clearance to test out a new treatment for spinal cord injury using human embryonic stem cells. However, the treatment towards embryonic stem cell research has not always been favorable in the policy side, as we'll get to later. So my problem that I wanted to address in my Capstone project was using the Geron case as an example. Can we look at the current policy towards stem cell research and see if it's ethically justified? And if so, how do we make it so that policy is ethically driven and immune from radical shifts? So the disciplines I employed were bioethics, which is itself a compound concept that utilizes perspectives from other disciplines such as biology, philosophy, and policy. The methodology I employed was that of a literature review. So I looked at different journal articles and different primary sources such as actual NIH policies and so forth. But to backtrack a little, what are stem cells? So what are we talking about when we talk about stem cell research? So stem cells is a very specific kind of cell that's undifferentiated. And what undifferentiated means is that it doesn't actually have a specific function, but rather that its function is to give rise to other cell types who may carry out a specific function in the body. There are two different kinds of stem cells, adult and embryonic. For this presentation, we're only going to be looking at embryonic. So embryonic stem cells are the controversial cells. These are cells that, as their name implies, are derived from embryos. The controversy is that to get these cells, it involves the destruction of a human embryo. You take the inner cell mass out of a blastocyst. So I have a picture of that here. Oh. So here's the blastocyst, and here are the inner cell mass, which is what's taken out to isolate the stem cells. Now looking at how this research has been treated policy-wise over time. During the Clinton administration was when human embryonic stem cells were first isolated, and during that time the policy was pretty liberal. It gave pretty much loose control. Research could proceed fairly unhindered. However, that changed dramatically when President Bush took office, and he instituted what's known commonly as the Bush ban, putting federal limitations on stem cell research, making it so that federal funding could not go towards stem cell research, which may not seem like such a big deal because that would allow state and private sector funding for stem cell research. However, included in that ban is that if federal funding had been used for equipment for prior research projects, that equipment could not be used for embryonic stem cell research. So that means that if you had a refrigerator, say, that you bought 10 years prior to wanting to do embryonic stem cell research for another project that was funded by the NIH, you could not use that refrigerator in project using embryonic stem cells. Excuse me. So this was a very big obstacle for embryonic stem cell research. That changed dramatically again when President Obama took office, because very shortly after taking office, he lifted the Bush ban, and shortly after that, NIH released new guidelines that gave a much more liberal, I guess you could say, guidelines for how stem cell research could proceed. So proceeding now to see whether or not the current policy is ethically sound, you have to first consider the stakeholders. So quite obviously, spinal cord injury patients have an interest in this drawn case, as well as drawn the company itself, as well as physicians who want to do the best they can to treat patients. But not so obviously is the case of whether or not embryos are primary stakeholders. And I have chosen to include embryos as stakeholders in my ethical analysis because of the fact that if you look at most of the arguments in opposition to stem cell research, they almost all carry embryos as stakeholders. So in order to get both perspectives, you really need to include it. So in beginning ethical analysis, I began by using the ethical theory of utilitarianism, which is a theory that involves maximizing the most good and minimizing the most harm. Fairly simple theory. And so in the case of stem cell research, it seems fairly obvious that this would be sort of supported by this theory, as many stakeholders benefit from this project, while the embryos may or may not benefit from this project, because it's not clear that it's necessarily against their stake to be destroyed, since the embryos that are being used in research are being discarded anyway. These are embryos that are coming from fertility clinics for IVF, and that they're left over and are destined to be discarded as biohazardous waste. So, deontology is another ethical theory. This is commonly cited by the opponents of stem cell research, and this involves sort of the application of certain duties and focusing on intentions rather than consequences of actions. And usually the argument sort of follows that if embryos are moral stakeholders, it violates a perfect duty of not committing unlawful killing or murder, if you want to call it, if you want to be so bold, that perfect duty is violated, and therefore the research is immoral. However, I took a different stance and found that this case is actually more analogous to organ donation, and that if you look at the case of these embryos that are about to be discarded, it's not dissimilar to someone who's been in a motorcycle accident and is brain dead and has his heart donated to save someone else's life. It's a very similar situation. So with the ethical analysis, the biology, understanding what a stem cell is, and looking at the policy, I looked at a bridging strategy of advancing through checks and balances in order to communicate between these different perspectives. And advancing through checks and balances just involves using different disciplines to have checks on one another. So looking at the current policy and seeing again whether or not it's ethically driven and ethically defensible, the ethical analysis seemed to show that the policy is defensible, and that if you looking at further into the policy of the different regulatory frameworks, it does seem that we have a system that is ethically driven and that should be immune from radical shifts. But as we saw with the policy history, it's not. So something must be missing. And what I concluded was that what is missing is there's really, if you look at the policy, there's the status of the embryo has not been clearly defined. We haven't really made up our mind of how we want to treat embryos, whether or not we want to treat them as complete moral stakeholders, as partial moral stakeholders, or not as moral stakeholders at all. The stance I took in this paper was that we should consider them as moral stakeholders, and that, as the ethical analysis showed, they are still, in the case of Duran, research is still justified using embryos in research. However, this may have other implications for other areas, such as abortion, in which, because you are aborting a viable fetus, the practice may not be ethically defensible. So this is something to consider. Some of the limitations of my project was that I did not look into the theological considerations. A lot of those arguments for and against, well, not so much for, but definitely against, involves sort of theological beliefs that embryos might have souls and that sort of thing. But I don't really have the disciplinary background to go into that, so I did not include that in my paper. Also, I was really looking at cutting-edge studies. To give sort of a funny anecdote, when I began my research, I began looking at books, and the first thing they said about embryonic stem cell research was, well, we're nowhere near application in humans. And I was like, well, that's not true anymore. So really, I had to really look at journal articles that were published in 2009 or not even yet published. So that was definitely a limitation. Considerations for future studies. As we saw in the utilitarian argument, there is sort of a reliance on the fact that these embryos are in excess and